Last week we started looking at this recitation from Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It was that moment where Moses is in Deuteronomy speaking to the Israelites as they've already left Egypt with God's power and they are preparing to enter the Promised Land, this place that God has made for them. And as they're getting ready, Moses knows he doesn't get to go with them. He was disobedient at a point, and God said, you don't get to enter into this place. And neither does that whole first generation that left Egypt. But there's going to be a bunch of their people getting ready to lead, and Joshua's getting ready to take it over and lead them into this Promised Land. This place that they say is flowing with milk and honey. This place that when the scouts went to check it out, they came back hauling this giant vine with grapes so large they'd never seen anything like it, as a representation of like, this place is amazing. So Moses is preparing them to go to this place, and they have been sustained by God literally in the wilderness for 40 years. I mean, remember, God has fed them with manna that they picked up off the ground every day. He's given them water, even, from a rock when need be. He has given them light to lead the way. He has done everything they have needed all this time. And they've had some really low points where they made some big mistakes and sometimes they got really tired of all this and just wanted to go back to Egypt because it was easier there. But now they're getting ready to go to this place, this paradise. And Moses says, before we go into this place, you need to remember our God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. Moses knows that when they go into this place and everything is going well, it is really easy to forget the God and what He has done. And he goes on in that chapter to say, remember what God has done. He's the one that pulled us out of Egypt. He's the one that convinced Pharaoh. He's the one that performed signs and wonders. He's the one that took care of you. So when everything's going super well, do not forget the Lord. So they recite this, and through Jesus' time, Israelites, the Hebrew people would recite the Shema, which is that first word, hear. They would recite that twice a day, every morning and every night. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And I think that's a great thing for us to do as well. Last week we talked about how Dr. Scott McKnight, he's a theologian professor at Northern Seminary, has written a book called The Jesus Creed. And what he's done is taken what Jesus says, instead of the Shema alone as a recitation, but has taken what Jesus says in Mark chapter 12 as a response to a question. Where they said, Teacher, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, he adds, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And then Jesus adds what is from Leviticus 19, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so what Dr. McKnight says is, this is the Jesus Creed. This is what Jesus tells us is important. This is our Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And what Dr. McKnight said is, I started saying it before my feet touched the ground in the morning, and at night before I picked my feet up off the ground, and any time in between when it came to mind. Now, I've been doing this for the last week or two, where over and over again I find myself remembering Shema, remembering and saying to myself this Jesus Creed, this Shema plus love your neighbor as yourself. And it has a way of centering you around the things that are important. And I encouraged you last week, if you were here, to learn it. All you got to do is go to Mark chapter 12, verses 29 to 31. It doesn't take very long to learn. It flows pretty well if you just go over it a few times and then begin to say it in the morning, at night, and when it comes to mind. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at that original Shema in Deuteronomy and look at the Hebrew words that are key so that we can understand what this actually is calling us to do. So last week we talked about the word Shema here, that it's not just about listening or hearing things go into our ears, but it's about obeying. Hearing, paying attention, and obeying. And he says, "Hear, O Israel." So today we're going to look at the next part of this. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. We have all these names for God, and we use different ones different times. And, sometimes when you open a prayer, it might indicate kind of the names that you often use, whether it's God or Lord or Heavenly Father or whatever it is that you might use. We have all these words for God, and we hear a bunch of them in the Bible. So what is His actual name? What does it mean in the Shema when it says, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one"? Watch this.
For thousands of years, every morning and evening, Jewish people have prayed these well-known words as a way of expressing their devotion to God. They're called the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength." We're going to look at the second key word here. Lord, written in all capital letters. This is the personal name of Israel's God. We first learn the meaning of this name in the story of Moses and the burning bush in the book of Exodus chapter 3. God appears to Moses and he commissions him to liberate the Israelites from slavery. And so Moses wonders, what if people ask the name of the God who has sent me? And so God responds, "Tell them, YHWH has sent me to you." Now, that Hebrew word YHWH means "I will be." In other words, God's name means that He is the one who is and who will be. God's existence doesn't depend on anyone or anything else. This God simply is. But it will sound kind of strange for Moses to go say to the Israelites, "I will be has sent me to you." Only God can say, "I will be." So in the next sentence, God tells Moses the version he should say aloud. "Yahweh, the God of our ancestors, He has sent me to you." Now, that word Yahweh is the ancient Hebrew form of the verb He will be. And this is the personal name of the God of Israel. It appears over 6,500 times in the Old Testament. Now, here's what's interesting. Over the centuries, Israelites wanted to honor the sacred nature of this divine name. So, as they read the Hebrew Bible aloud and they came to this name, they stopped saying Yahweh and instead started saying the Hebrew word for Lord, which is Adonai. Now, this practice has been continued throughout the centuries, and so later, when people started translating the Bible into English, they adopted the same practice. Instead of spelling out the divine name, they translated it as Lord, spelled in all capital letters. Okay, you got that? Good, because there's more. Ancient Jewish scribes wanted to prevent anyone from even accidentally saying this name aloud when you read the Hebrew Bible. And so they came up with a visual device to remind you to make sure you say Adonai. They took the 4 consonant letters of the divine name. These letters correspond to our English letters, YHWH. Then they inserted the 3 vowels from the word Adonai and combined these together to create an artificial hybrid word, which if you pronounced it, it would say Yahuwah, but no Israelite ever said Yahuwah. It's simply a visual reminder to say the word Adonai. Now, it gets more interesting. Much later, Christian scribes came along who didn't know that Yahuwah was an artificial word, and so they began to say it aloud and spell it in their writings. This is the word that eventually entered into English as Jehovah. It's a word many people still use today. But the main thing is, the word Lord in all capital letters is an indication of the divine name. Don't confuse it with the word Lord in your English translations that's not in all capital letters. That is the actual Hebrew word Adon, which just means Lord or master. This word can refer to people like kings or the master of a servant, even a shepherd over his sheep. And sometimes biblical authors will use this word to refer to God, like in the phrases the Lord of all the earth or the Lord of lords. But behind all of these words, Jehovah, Lord, Adonai, stands the original divine name of the God of Israel. It refers to the one who was, who is, and who forever will be.
Clear? All right. Let's slow this down a little bit. There's this great book by a guy named John Mark Comer called God Has a Name. And it's a reminder. It goes through several of the things you also see in this video by the Bible Project, but goes over the reality that our God has an actual name. Now, in English, it's weird because we use the word God, which really doesn't mean anything. It's really defined as just something you worship, right? So what we do is we use the word God and we just capitalize it to mean Him, Yahweh, right? That's kind of the idea. That is Yahweh. That is the God of Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God that sent Jesus, His Son, into the world. So we capitalize it. But really, it's just a word that means something you worship, because if it's not capital, it means other gods, which we can make anything that we worship outside of Him, right? So it doesn't really describe who God is at all. So in our Bibles, we see oftentimes, as they describe, the word Lord used, most of the time all capitals. And that word was Adonai, which is a title, which is not the same as a name. I learned that when I tried to get my family to call me pastor all the time, and it didn't work. They didn't want to do it. Or when my dad got his doctorate finally and thought we all should call him Dr. Robin Stoops, which is not happening either. Because titles are not intimate. Titles are not what we call our friends and our family. Titles are what we call people we don't really know, right? Well, that's not the intention with God. God's desire is for us to know Him. And so this use of Lord was less about Him and more about the Israelites' fear of breaking a commandment. So in Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, it says this, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses His name." Now you know that probably because somebody has told you this is why we say, "Oh my gosh," right? Or "oh my goodness," because we don't say the Lord's name in vain, because that's breaking a commandment, that's a sin, so we don't do that. Well, the Jewish people were so afraid of using Yahweh wrong, saying His name wrong, and breaking that commandment, that they decided that instead of even writing it so that people would maybe accidentally say it when they shouldn't, they would always insert something else. That Lord title, Adonai, was inserted. And then they showed you kind of where that Jehovah word comes from, where they kind of created a word by putting them together so that when you read that you knew, oh, this is talking about Yahweh, I better say Adonai because I don't want to misuse the name of God. So where's the name come from? It has this weird meaning that we typically read, as Megan read for us, I am who I am. And he says, tell them the I am sent you. Essentially, the being who is and who always will be. Every other being in the world is temporary, but Yahweh is. There is no beginning. There is no end. There is no temporary. He is. That's what the word Yahweh means. What's interesting is, until Moses, God never gave His name. We see earlier in Genesis and leading into Exodus, we see all sorts of other names. And in Genesis, most of the time, it's the word Elohim, which means spiritual beings. And He was called the Elohim of Elohims, which is the greatest spiritual being of all the spiritual beings. But He didn't give His name. Instead, what He did was when he spoke to people, He said, He connected Himself with who He was associated with. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of your fathers. I'm the God of Isaac and of Jacob. So instead of giving His actual name, He would say who He knew. You know me. You should trust me because I am the God that your fathers trusted. It wasn't until Moses that He gave His name. Now, all that may not mean anything unless it does. And I'm going to look at one moment where His name is defined for us beyond just God is or He will be, but is defined for us by His attributes. If you would, turn with me to Exodus 33. Exodus chapter 33. And this is an encounter that Moses has with God, with Yahweh. And it starts with them in this place they call the tent of meeting. This is kind of the mobile temple. Before they could build a real temple, they just had this little tent, and that's where he would go hang out with God. It's called the tent of meeting. In Exodus chapter 33, starting in verse 11. I'm going to read this. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You've said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you're pleased with me, teach me your ways so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, don't send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." Here's what he means by that. Now show me who you are. Show me who you really are. The Lord said, "I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, Yahweh, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But he said, "But you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock, and when my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock, and I'll cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I'll remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." So he tells Moses, "Go up on this mountain. I'm going to put you in this rock. I'm going to cover you up so you don't see my face because you'll die. But I'm going to let you see my back just so you can see who I am, because you've asked me to, and I've said that you're mine, and I'm going to be your God. And so therefore I'm going to let you see this." But he said, when I go by and you see my back, I'm going to proclaim my name to you. And this is what he means. Not just Yahweh. He's already told him Yahweh is his name. That was a while ago. What he's going to do is he's going to define what his name means for his people. This is what it says. Moses goes up on the mountain, and in verse 5 of the next chapter, 34, it says, "Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, Yahweh. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, 'Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of their parents to the third and the fourth generation.'" So God comes and he says, "I'm going to proclaim my name." And when he does, here's what he says. He says, "Yahweh, Yahweh." Now, if you wanted to emphasize something today, what you may do is put it in italics. You may put it in bold, or if you really want to yell at people, all caps, right? Like that's what we do to emphasize something that we're writing. Well, in Hebrew, what they do to emphasize something is they repeat it twice. So when he comes, it says, in your version, it probably says, the Lord, would have literally been Yahweh, Yahweh. And it's the emphasis of, okay, listen, this is my name. The compassionate and gracious God. He goes on to describe who he is in order of importance. This is a really important passage. These verses, when he describes himself, are the most reused verses in the Bible, in the Old Testament. This is like the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. You know, that one that everybody knows and is always, everybody always will quote everywhere else. You see this quoted more than any other thing in the Old Testament. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He describes his name. I am the God who's compassionate. The Hebrew words for compassionate literally were the same words they used for a mother and her newborn infant. These are the words, these are the attributes of motherhood, of the kind of love that we don't see outside of a mother and her child. Compassionate and gracious, the first words he used to define his name. Then he goes on, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, forgiving. The attributes of God's name, Yahweh. And then he goes to the next part. After those things, he then goes on to say, the one who will not leave the guilty unpunished, meaning a God who is just, who is going to do what is right for his creation, bring justice to the world. Now here's the thing. In a world of all sorts of gods and God worship that the Hebrews were in, imagine a God who is defined by compassion, grace, forgiveness, abounding love, and justice. There is not a single God anywhere else that looks like that. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. One other quick piece I want to touch on before we finish this morning. That comment, the Lord is one, is really important. Now, oftentimes today we think of other little g gods as fake, as not real. We think of idols, something you just kind of build up and create, but it's not real. But the reality is that in this world, we have seen in the Bible throughout history, over and over again, we've seen descriptions of other Elohim, other spiritual beings. God is not alone as a spiritual being in this world. Now, God is alone because He is the Elohim of Elohims. He is the creator of all. He is the God of gods. But He is not alone in the spiritual realm. So the fact that all these other places like Egypt and like Babylon and all these places had other gods, they believe those gods to be real. They're not God. They're not Yahweh, but they're not fake either. And it's important for us to recognize how important it was for them to say, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. That we are going to worship Yahweh, not these others. Not Baal, not the gods of the Egyptians, not any of these other spiritual beings. We believe in Yahweh, the God who is compassionate and gracious and loving and just. So as we say this Shema, as I really encourage you to try and learn this Shema, this Jesus Creed, this Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Remember who the Lord is that we're talking about. Yahweh, who is not created, never ending, complete, but who defines Himself to Moses as compassionate and gracious, as loving, as just. This is the God we worship. And that matters.